Hi everyone. So firstly, I'd like to thank Marco and the team at the university for inviting us along today. So my name's Alex. I'm a senior sports scientist at StatSports. I'm responsible for assisting our elite clients with the implementation of the tracking system. So GPS is pretty much an outdated term now. We're very much a micro-technology device. So we don't only have GPS in the system or GNSS as the technology is advanced. We now have an accelerometer, gyroscope, magnetometer, some seriously advanced tech that sits in the back of a player's jersey. A little bit about us. So StatSports are the world-leading providers of this technology. So we have offices, obviously you can see, across the world: the UK, USA, Italy, Germany, Australia, Argentina, and we also have an office in Qatar, obviously for obvious reasons, being the World Cup that's just gone this past 2022. So we're the world-leading providers of this technology. We work with elite clubs. You can see some of our clientele there. One of my personal favourites is that one there. Any guesses for who that is and what sport that is for? Anyone? That's the American Ultimate Disc League. That's Ultimate Frisbee. So pretty much if it's played outside on a field, we are the go-to performance monitoring solution for that. Saying that, in 2019, we released our Apex Athlete Series and our Apex Coach Series application. So prior to that, we had the Pro Series, which is the highest tier of GPS system that you can buy. It's used by the likes of Liverpool, Arsenal, the FA, Brazil, Manchester City, Manchester United, the real big dogs there. We had the Apex Team Series, which is a much more budget-friendly, cost-effective solution. It's again, you can still do your live streaming. You've still got the same kind of capabilities that the Pro Series has, but for a much more affordable price. And then we launched, as I said, the Apex Coach Series, Apex Athlete Series. So the Athlete Series is for the individual player. It's very much for your weekend warrior, someone who really wants to compare their data. So some of our StatSports ambassadors, the likes of Harry Kane, Harry Maguire, Raheem Sterling. And then the Apex Coach Series puts that data in the hands of coaches at all levels of sport. So enough of a sales pitch. I'm going to leave that to outside. I'm going to talk to you today about the application of the tracking systems within team sport. So the first thing I'm going to do to prove it's not a sales pitch is tell you what the device can't do. So no device in the world of microtechnology can predict team performance. An example I'll give of that is this study here from the 2018 FIFA World Cup that was in Russia. This is a study that looked at the locomotor characteristics, so the external load measures of teams from all the federations across the world. So all of the federations that are at the World Cup. I'll draw your attention to that line there. So these are the external load measures they use, things like top speed, number of sprints, sprint distance, the distance covered in the higher velocity bands, things that ultimately Sky Sports would have you believe run more, win more, things like that. They found that there was no difference at all between any of the federations. If you were from the federations such as Egypt or Saudi Arabia, you ran exactly the same as the likes of Germany, Brazil. There was no difference at all. So the run more, win more doesn't work. It can't predict team performance. Can it predict individual performance? I'd argue no. So this is the top walking distances of the Qatar World Cup. So these are the players who covered the most amount of walking during a game at the World Cup. Straight away, there you are. So straight away, Lionel Messi was 3 of the top 10 walking distances at the World Cup. Again, if you go along with that Sky Sports narrative of they're not doing enough sprints, they're not sprinting, things like that, Lionel Messi would not be arguably a very good football player. Now, we know he won the Golden Ball for the tournament and he led his country to the World Cup, arguably cementing his place as the greatest player of all time, but I'm not going to upset any Cristiano Ronaldo fans. So, final point on there, no device can predict injury. I'd also argue no device on its own can also make your players fitter, faster, stronger. It's just not the case the device can do that. Again, an argument here. So this is a study by Jan Ekstrand. It's the research group up in Scandinavia. They looked at the number of injuries sustained over a 18-year period. So that's both in professional sport, but it's also in recreational sport as well. They did find that injuries were decreasing, but I'd argue due to the widespread adoption of performance tracking systems at any level, there was a 3% decrease of injuries over 18 years. I'd argue if there's more and more people using tracking systems, that percentage should be a lot higher. As well as that, hamstring injury rates have doubled. So arguably the thing that we could have the most impact on, which I'd argue later on, hamstring injuries is one of those, and I'm sure Kevin will come on to say that it's not just about how much they run, But that's another thing there is ultimately if hamstring injuries have doubled again because of, despite the widespread adoption, no device on its own can predict injury, no device on its own can prevent injury. So why bother? What's the point? Why invest? Why bring in a tracking system at all? Well, we know that I'm going to reference our device in particular, but we know that the tracking systems and the microtechnology can provide an accurate and reliable measure of external load. And you're going to hear that word a lot throughout this presentation. So external load, as it kind of boils down, is the work completed by the athlete measured independently of internal characteristics. That obviously differs to internal load, which is the physiological and the psychological stress imposed on the athlete. And you can measure that quite simply with the things like heart rate. You can look at the subjective RPE, rating of perceived exertion, wellness measures, things like that. But external load is what did the athlete do, quite simply. What's the point in measuring it? Why is it important? Well, we know that if the external load measure itself is a determinant of performance, it can determine the athlete's readiness for competition. It can analyse the load-performance relationship. It can support appropriate planning for training and competition. It can provide a necessary tool for injury mitigation. And it can also inform return to play protocols for those coming back from injury. It's really important to note here that there are multiple measures of external load. It doesn't matter what a company tells you when they're trying to sell you a system, there is no one global load measure. There's not a one tell-all solution. An example here is I'm going to talk a lot today about tracking systems and what they do out on the pitch, but that tells you nothing about what they've done in the gym. So they can have multiple impacts on the athlete, and it's important that an effective athlete management system brings in multiple components of external load. So we've established that external load is important. We're going to track it. We're going to invest in a GPS system. We're going to buy StatSports. Then it comes to, okay, so the Apex device gives me over 260 different measures of external load. That's as varied from the number of accelerations a player does to the G-force that's acting on the body at any one time. So there's a large selection of parameters that I can select. I'm not going to track all 260 because I haven't got the time, I haven't got the manpower, I haven't got the resources. We need to select metrics that we want to keep it simple. So practitioners need to select metrics based on the following criteria. So does that metric relate to the identified determinants of performance? You can see the example there. I've put the count of accelerations and decelerations in football. Now, football is a sport very much characterised by changes of direction and changes of speed. We know, for example, that the most common common action that precedes a goal-scoring moment in women's football is a deceleration, because they're trying to isolate space from the defender to increase the likelihood of scoring. So we would probably count the number of accelerations and decelerations because it is related to that determinant of performance. The metric also can relate to the intended training stimulus. And I see there I've got an example of maximum speed exposure. What I mean there is if we're trying to elicit a training stimulus where we want to get the player exposure to maximum speed, it would be a really good idea if we tracked maximum speed. The final one there, I'm going to put my science hat on here, I'm going to really appeal to Marco and his group, is the metric itself needs to be valid, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be sensitive. What I mean by valid is, does it measure what it says it measures? Reliable, if I was to do exactly the same test in exactly the same environmental conditions, do I get exactly the same number? And sensitive, does it change with changes in performance? Does it change with changes in fatigue? Things like that. Does it actually detect change? So we are really dedicated to furthering knowledge in this space and furthering validation. There's no point us providing metrics if they haven't gone through a rigorous validation process. This is one of the examples of that. This is by Simon McLeod's group at Ulster Rugby. So we offer a metric in our product suite called collisions. So it's just number of collisions in a rugby environment. So obviously really valuable. Rugby isn't just characterised by locomotor characteristics, so the running demands. If you're a forward in particular, you're going through a lot of collisions during a game, and they can have a massive effect in terms of your neuromuscular load. So ultimately what we did is we did a validation study. We compared the number that you get straight from the device. We compared that to a performance analyst. Sat down, watched all the footage, and they counted the number of collisions. They found that we were a valid measure and a reliable measure for collisions within rugby. The second one, This is, again, reliability. So this is by Zach Krang's group. This is at Australian Catholic University, compared us and our biggest competitor, which is, I'm not actually going to reference him here. They found that we were suitable and consistent for measures of distance, speed, and also for accelerations and decelerations. Now, I'm going to point you in the direction of that conclusion. Our competitor wasn't reliable for accelerations and decelerations, so take from that what you want. Final one here, so this will appease Marco. This is the study around the accelerometer-derived metrics. So we again want it to be sensitive to the important things that we're trying to track. This found that one of our measures is the dynamic stress load, which is an accelerometer-derived metric. You can get it indoors as an example. It was sensitive to changes in neuromuscular fatigue when you did exactly the same running drill. So again, I'll show you that. Ooh. Keep doing that. There you are, perfect. So in conclusion, this study reports that dynamic stress load and fatigue index can be valid metrics to monitor fatigue related to movement strategy. So again, is it sensitive to changes in movement due to changes in fatigue? So let's actually get onto the application. We've got our metrics, we've selected what metrics we're going to use. So the two guys up there, Martin Boucher and Ben Simpson, this was when they were at Paris Saint-Germain. So they've proposed that there are 3 objectives when you bring in a tracking system. What's the point? Well, the point is we want to better understand the locomotor, so those kind of running characteristics and external load of the sport, and in 2 different contexts. They want to understand what the game looks like, because that's the most important thing, but they also want to have a look at what training looks like as well. They also want to apply it to assist the programming of team training external load. And I'm sure the speaker after me, Andy, you'll come on to talk about how they're manipulating external load to achieve training adaptations, minimize fatigue, and also mitigate injury risk. We want to inform decisions pertaining to performance and injury risk as they relate to an individual's program. Now that study there, Torres, Ronda et al. 2022, I love that study. I think it's brilliant. I encourage anyone who goes to work in sports science to read it in terms of it's not just the application of a tracking system, it's the application of any technology you bring into a club. They condensed what Martin and Ben had said, and they condensed that into 3 main objectives. So the 3 objectives into a framework. So each component of that framework, so describe, plan, and monitor, they overarch, they overlap, they inform each other, which is really, really nice. And you can see that in that Venn diagram there. Apologies, it is quite small. So you can see that they're overarching components. So the describe informs the planning informs the monitoring informs the describing, and so forth. Now I'm going to talk about each part of those components in a bit more detail with reference to applying a tracking system within a team environment. So the first component of that is the describe component. Now, ultimately, when we bring a tracking system in, our initial application is to quantify the external load characteristics of training and match play. What does the game look like from an external load point of view? What kind of distances are they covering? If we've identified accelerations and decelerations as a massive determinant of performance, well, how many are they doing? What does training look like on a day-to-day basis? How does it change as the training week progresses? So I love this picture here. That's Dr. Tom Riley. He was a researcher at Liverpool John Moores University, one of my previous institutions. The reason I love this picture here is that Tom used to sit in the main stand, and he used to note down how much a player would move during the 1970s. So that was our first notational analysis. It was the first time we had any type of this player covered 5,000 meters or something like that. Now, I love that picture there because Tom was at Liverpool at the time. At the time in the 1970s, Liverpool were winning everything. They were winning the Champions League in 77, so the European Cup in 77, 78. They were winning league titles. Tom went to watch Everton every week. So he was very unlucky there. I will say Everton were better than they are now, but that's why I love that picture. We know from work that's been done since Tom with this describe component in terms of looking at the external load characteristics of football in particular, that match outputs can be influenced by a variety of factors that are very contextual. So the first one's playing position. You're going to compare a centre-back to a centre midfielder. The centre midfielder is going to do a lot more in terms of the external load parameters. Level of competition. I'll come on to talk about a really nice rugby study that's looked at the differences between levels of competition. The kind of narrative or the first belief would be is the higher you get to international level, straight away you're thinking that everything goes up. That's not the case. Certain things go up, certain things go down. Standard of opposition, obviously, again, you might be thinking that goes hand in hand with level of competition. Again, it's very different. For example, the Premier League has higher outputs than the Champions League, but the standard of opposition is going to be very different to what you face. Competition structure, so obviously the World Cup is a good example of this. The further you go in an international tournament, the more condensed the games get. You're playing more frequently. The actual external load characteristics might go down in terms of output. Playing style, obviously you see that when a new manager, new coach goes into a team, that you saw straight away with Jurgen Klopp went into Liverpool, they had a load of hamstring injuries, things like that. The playing style has a massive influence in terms of external load. Game state as well, obviously external load goes up if you're losing. If you're winning heavily, then the external load might go down. Things like that. This is a good example. So this is by the guys at Ipswich Town a few years ago. This is just quantifying the external load of different games at different levels. So as you can see, there wasn't too much of a difference between under 18s to the first team, apart from, in fact, explosive distance was higher with the under 18s compared to the first team. But you can see that there is some metrics, for example, dynamic stress load, there is a large difference between under 18s and first team. So again, that's just an example of the describe component. We're describing what are the demands at each level. If you're a big football fan and you've never read one of these, I couldn't encourage you to read the technical report highly enough. It's done by the guys at UEFA every single time the Champions League finishes. You get lovely slides like this, which, again, quite limited in terms of the external load parameters they used, but gives you a nice insight into the external load characteristics of top-level football. So you've got average distance per game per team. You've got average distance per player in a match. There was one the previous year they did maximum speed achieved, and it was this was the year Liverpool won the Champions League. It was, you might remember, Virgil van Dijk ran from the penalty area at Barcelona the whole way back to his own penalty area. I think he clocked about 36 kilometres an hour, which is ridiculously quick. But again, really encourage you to read these. Again, it's the describe component. It's telling you what a game looks like. And then this was the study that I was talking about from a rugby perspective. So this was by Pete Tierney, who was at Leinster Rugby at the time, comparing British and Irish Cup, Pro 14, European Cup, and International Rugby. So you can see that, for example, stuff like collisions count, it's a very linear change. So the lowest is that kind of the lower form, the British and Irish Cup. The highest is the international rugby. Ultimately, the reason for that is that there's less space at international level. People make less mistakes. But things like decelerations, there's quite a linear decrease above 3 meters per second squared. High-speed running straight away. Why is that? Again, less space. You haven't got the time, the space, the distance to be able to accumulate higher speeds. Sprint distance is the same. Total distance is the same. So straight away we can look at the international rugby. There's more of a contact demand. There's a large collision demand. The high-speed running demand is decreased compared to those club competitions. Again, all of those are really good examples of the describe component. And ultimately, where do we go from there? Again, the describe component, very simplistic. It's been around for a very long time. We kind of know the external load demands of the more conventional sports, your football, your rugby, things like that. One proposal that has been made to advance this knowledge is to start integrating physical with tactical data. So we have a feature within our system. It's called our Sonra Video Manager. It's a free application. You can add in the video tags and the video analysis. You can start looking at contextual data. Really useful for return to play. So when you're looking at, okay, there's very limited approach when it comes to just linear running and things like that. When you get a player back, we want to be able to design drills that follow that control to chaos continuum by Matt Taberner, where you're looking at integrating football-specific drills into the rehab process. If we can identify what different load looks like in different areas of the game, we can start to design drills that ultimately look a lot more like the game when it comes to return to play. This is a good example of that application. So this is by Paul Bradley, who again has worked at John Moores University. On that side, you've got the high intensity distance, the high speed running for playing position, averages across a game. Obviously, you've got, as you'd expect, centre back is the lowest, wide players are the highest. And then on this side here, on the left-hand side, of my left-hand side, your right-hand side, you've got that cut into different segments of the game. So you've got things like drive inside through the middle, run the channel, running behind. You can start to characterise different positions based off of how they're accumulating that external load. Another good example here, this is a hockey example, so anyone who's a big fan of field hockey. This is by Owen, at Head of Athletic Performance, has previously spoken at this event in its COVID form online. His his PhD work around whether or not there's any influence of possession status on the external load characteristics of hockey. As you can see, there's not too much difference for some of the positions, but in possession, as an example, on one side is meters per minute covered, so the distance they're covering per minute. On this side is explosive distance covered per minute. As you can see, there's quite a large difference here in explosive distance. For defenders, they cover a lot more in possession than out of possession. Again, we're informing what are the most physically demanding, what is the biggest external load demand of each facet of the game. And then there's another example of that, same author, but this is looking at different phases within the game, phases of play. So you've got like attacking counter, offensive pressing, opposition corner, established defense, established attack, and you're looking at what is the most demanding in terms of an external load. Where are they accumulating the most sprint distance? Attacking counter. Obviously, there's opportunities to exploit space. Something like established attack, you're probably going to be looking at similar explosive distance. They're covering a lot more accels and decels. Why? Because they're having to change direction, change speed in order to isolate themselves from opposition players and create goal-scoring opportunities. So what we want from the describe component is we want that to start influencing our plan, our training plan. So as I say, they form a training plan. Ultimately, when you sit down to describe a training plan is made out of two components. You've got the objective data, so external load characteristics, and you've got the subjective, which is coach experience, coach experience and their understanding of the sports characteristics. Within team sports, performance is incredibly complex. Again, like I said, run more does not equal win more. Just because you make your players fitter does not mean they're going to win the league. In fact, if you actually look at the external load profile of a team like Manchester City, it's very middle of the pack when it comes to the Premier League. I think that's because they're quite risk adverse in the transition, but they win the league pretty much every single season. So ultimately, just because they have higher external load doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win. Performance is very complex, and we need to have more consideration when we're designing training and we're doing the training plan. We need to take more consideration than just trying to maximise physical outputs. So the training plan itself will aim to manipulate external load in an effort to achieve three things. We want desired training adaptations. We do want to make our players fitter. We want to make the players faster. We want to make the players stronger, more robust to the game and to the training environment. Ultimately, that bleeds into enhancing their physical performance, but we also want to mitigate injury risk. Oh, go back. So how can we do that from gathering external load, and how can external load and tracking systems really influence that? Well, the biggest one is drill design. Ultimately, what are we doing on a day-to-day basis, on a drill-by-drill basis? So we can actually utilise the external load measures that we've identified from the describe component, to inform the session and or individual drill design. So we can create drill databases, which is where we store the external load characteristics, the external load profile of every single drill that we do, whether that's the rules, the duration, the sets, and the repetition structure. And then we can use that objective information to work in line with the coaching staff to create drills that not only elicit the desired physical stimulus, but we also achieve physical, technical, and tactical objectives at the same time. Now, there's a great researcher out in Italy, Andrea Riboli, who is doing, his PhD is all around manipulating small-sided games, which is the most common training drill within football, is small-sided games. How can we manipulate the constraints, the design of a small-sided game to elicit those physical objectives that we want to elicit? Because coaches love small-sided games for the technical and tactical elements. So straight away, we can manipulate the number of players in the drill. Again, that if we put more players in a small area, that decreases the area per player. It's probably more acceleration and deceleration focus because they're having to change direction and change speed more often. Or if for example, pitch dimensions, we make the pitch bigger, we're probably going to get a bit more high-speed running, more distance covered in velocity bands, more sprints, more higher speeds, because there's more space to exploit. We can change the game rules. For example, we could add in an offside line. Suddenly there's more space in behind the defence rather than teams sitting back and encouraging, creating less space in the attacking portions. Sorry, goalkeepers, if there's anyone here, but we can remove the goalkeepers. We know that increases external load, ultimately because they're having to cover 2 goals rather than 1. Game duration, obviously you can change that around. And we've also found that Andrea has also found that coach encouragement can influence external load. Just by shouting on the sideline, people run more, which is quite an interesting caveat. Again, the final component that you saw in that framework is the monitor framework. So obviously we've done our training plan. And then we move on to our monitor component, which there's two purposes of. So we need to assess the interaction between what they've actually done in terms of external load compared to what we planned in the training plan. And then we can also analyse the dose-response relationship. Now, my girlfriend, she's a vet, so she thinks obviously very much dose-response in terms of medication. You give a certain amount of medication, they either get better or they get worse, and you change. The same goes for external load. So external load, you can do a training session. They obviously have the external load characteristics is the dose, and then how the athlete responds to that. Are they more tired the day after? Are they complaining of higher RPE? Things like that. Again, you can use that information to change the training plan or change the dosage in the future. So ultimately, performance staff, we aim to plan the external load to achieve those training adaptations, minimise fatigue, and obviously mitigate injury risk. Sorry. So we have a feature within our live system. So when you're doing live data tracking called thresholds. Now thresholds allows practitioners to track data live and also compare the live data, what they've actually done. They can compare that to the planned training load of the session. So they can look and see if they've achieved their physical targets for the session. If they have, then ultimately how that influences the training session is up to the practitioner. But also, if they haven't, it enables in-session adjustments to achieve the planned load. Now, in its most basic form, that could just be a top-up run at the end of the session to achieve, for example, if high-speed running is a metric that you've put a lot of focus on, and that's ultimately your physical stimulus. In its most basic form, a top-up run could be done there, but it could be, okay, we could change the manipulation of the drill to elicit the physical demands that we want, whilst also achieving that technical and tactical. So as I say, monitor component, it has two main purposes, which is, did they do what we wanted them to do? If they didn't, what do we do about that? And then also, they've done what we wanted them to do, how do they respond to that, and how can that influence the training plan going forward? So this is just an example of that thresholds. As you can see, you can visualize your data to be color coded, to be, obviously there's like max speed, there's there, total distance, again, if players have gone above. You can make it individual, obviously, if everyone's got their own individual external load goals, things like that, it's up to you. And I've got the iPad out there if you want to come have a closer look. So this is just an example again of the monitor component. So this is, again, really encourage people to read this. This is Howden and Insurance Group, but they looked at the European Football Injury Index, This was published in September. Big one here, especially if you're physios and things like that. Ultimately, injury count and the cost of injuries is here. So this is in millions of pounds. So you're looking already at the Bundesliga, you're looking at around over 60 million cost. I mean, the Premier League, you're nearly at 240 million pounds per season worth of players. That's if you're paying wages to players who are injured. Obviously, sorry players, but you are useless when you're injured, ultimately for performance. But we're paying them a lot of money there. So we ultimately need to get that number down, and that would bring that number down. They've also got the cost along here, the cost of the injury and the count of injuries. So straight away there, COVID-19 accounted for a lot of injuries, times missed, because the players couldn't train or couldn't play in the past season. Obviously, muscle injuries, that's very vague there, I don't really love that. But the big one there that I've highlighted is hamstring injuries. And the reason I've highlighted hamstring injuries is we know the hamstring injuries are costing a lot of money, and they're far less frequent than COVID-19 or muscle injuries, which is, again, strange because the hamstring is a muscle. But there's a massive cost associated there, and they're occurring quite frequently. The reason I've highlighted hamstring injury, again, I'm going to pop that study up there, is we know it's doubled as well in the last 18 years or so. We know it's doubled, so we know it's very frequent, and ultimately it's getting more and more frequent. But we also know that there are tangible effects of external load on hamstring injury in particular. So for example, there's this study. This is influence of sprint volume, so the amount of distance players are covering at higher speeds. We know that can have a massive effect on a maximal speed. That can have a massive effect on eccentric hamstring strength. There's this study. Again, sprinting, a key piece of the hamstring injury risk management puzzle. Again, we found that the amount of players are sprinting has a massive effect on hamstring injury. And the final point, this is a great study by Shane Malone at Dublin GAA, basically saying that doing high chronic load, but also exposing players to high speed running, to maximum sprinting, again, can reduce injury risk. So we've straight away there, I've given you 3 examples. That's from a quick look into the research. That can give you 3 examples that we know that hamstring injuries are very frequent, but we also know there's something that we can do about it. And that's a graph here from that Malone study that basically says likelihood of subsequent injury absolutely massively drops if you are giving them 7 to 9 or so weekly exposures to maximum velocity. So we know hamstring injuries are a problem, but we're using tracking systems. We can monitor the amount of exposure players are getting to maximum velocity and hopefully bring that number down, save the club a bit of money. Just an example, hamstring injuries last season cost the Premier League each club cost them £45 million per year. For that money, you could have bought Luis Diaz at Liverpool, just an example. So there's a massive factor in terms of actually reducing hamstring injury in football, and we know there's a tangible benefit of having a tracking system in place and utilising it via monitoring of weekly speed exposure to bring down hamstring injuries. The other component of monitor that is becoming the monitor component, it's coming more and more common, is that we know sport's evolving. We know sport is changing year on year on year. So we know that because of changes to rules, we know that due to changes to fixture scheduling, that there's a growth in professionalism, that there's more and more training knowledge events like this. We know that because of there's changes to tactics, we know that the external load characteristics of sport are changing. An example of that is that the high-speed running and sprint demands of Premier League football has grown exponentially across all positions, in particular fullbacks, so the wide defenders. They've experienced a 63% rise in sprint distance from 2012 to now. So we know that high-speed running sprint distance has absolutely exploded for fullbacks. Any guesses for why that is?
Just higher demand to play attacking football.
Bang on. Yep. So you've got more and more coaches like Klopp, Guardiola, people like that who've come into the league, and they're expecting the fullback to do a lot more in terms of the positional demands. Ultimately, the days of I'm going to name a name, but I shouldn't do. Alan Hutton, someone like that, who was quite a limited fullback, more of a defensive-minded fullback, the days of him are kind of gone in the Premier League. You don't see that player anymore. You're seeing a lot more Reece Jameses, players like that, who can elicit the physical demands needed to play that position. So the ongoing monitoring data, so to keep collecting data is massively useful to updating the objective description of sport. Like I said, it's bleeding into that describe phase again. And we know, for example, the biggest factor is rule changes. So rule changes can have two effects. They can have an acute effect, where the second a rule comes into place, the external load profile of the sport changes, and they can have chronic impacts. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples on that. So the first one is, anyone here rugby league fan? No, we're too far in the south for that. So rugby league, especially the NRL in Australia, massive sport out there. It's arguably, instead of Australian rules football, it's their biggest sport. They instigated the 6 again rule. Suddenly, the collision demands of rugby league absolutely skyrocketed. There was the Players Association basically came out and went, we can't. You're going to have head injuries galore because of what you've done here. So they've had to reconsider the 6 again rule. But straight away is ultimately that's an acute effect. That's a change to the external load profile of the sport because of a rule change. The second one there, obviously there's a few more Premier League football fans in the room. The 5 substitutes rule. So now Premier League teams can make 5 substitutions. Straight away, that's more of a chronic impact. You can manage the load of the squad a bit better. You can bring on more subs. You can take players who are more in that red zone of external load off and save their legs a little bit more. So again, straight away there you can see, make a change of rule, acute effect, chronic effect. We don't know that unless we're doing monitoring data and then we're informing the description. Again, how that now bleeds into our training plan design and things like that. If I was a rugby league, my pre-season, I'd definitely be doing a lot more contact at work and collision elements because I need to prepare the players for that. But and again, acutely in terms of recovery protocols, things like that need to be influenced. The 5 substitutes rule, my squad immediately gets bigger because I'm going to have to manage the load of more people. And if I have more people, I can manage the load of the group better. But yeah, so to conclude, microtechnology cannot predict team, individual performance or potential injury risk. We just can't do it. I'm sorry for that. One day we might be able to. The Apex device does actually provide an accurate and reliable measure of external load. Now, external load, as we've identified, is an incredibly important measure within effective athlete management systems due to the fact it's related to performance, injury risk, and the planning process and the training process. How can it be applied? We can describe the external load characteristics of the sport. We can plan manipulations in external load to achieve desired training outcomes, and then we can monitor actual versus plan load and how the sport is evolving over time to influence the describe and planning phase. Now, thank you very much for your time. I'm just going to give you, this is the sales pitch, unfortunately. So this is, we're very proud of the clients we work with, and those clients obviously give us a lot of feedback. ultimately what we want to do is we are constantly evolving our system. So these are just some of the updates that are coming out at the end of this month for our Pro Series system. So one of those is the multiple activity graph. You are able to cut training drills and cut the session up for multiple players at multiple times. The reason for this, especially in a context like hockey, for example, there are rolling subs. So players' start time and end time of their time on pitch is different, and you need to be able to edit that. So this is just a quick video showing a coach, for example, cutting up the training session on the multiple activity graphs. They can create a phase of play, go in here, edit, create a drill, add the players who are at the same start and end time of the drill, and then they can edit that. You get a drill timeline so that you're able to look at the training session as a whole and things like that. Won't go too much depth. The other aspect of us is now we are cloud-based. We have a cloud-based platform, so you can access your data anywhere in the world. The best example I've seen of this is I look after Sporting Club de Portugal out of Lisbon. They have a training camp for the first team in the Algarve. They have a training camp for the B team that was in Abu Dhabi, which is a strange way around if you think about it, because I thought the money would be with the first team. And then they have the youth sides that are based in Lisbon. The head of performance can see every single person's data the second that they download it onto the Sonra cloud from anywhere in the world. They can access that from any tablet or any laptop in the world at any one time. So you have complete access to your data wherever you go. And that's it. Thank you.
Very much, Alex.
Pleasure.
I would like to open the floor to some questions. Anyone would like to ask a question to Alex, please?
Alex, that was great. You said that external load or any of those factors can't predict performance or winning.
Yep.
Is there a lower threshold over which you think you have to get actually to be in competition, or even a ratio if Team A is producing this external load, Team B needs to be in a certain ratio to be.
Yeah, no, I remember there was a big debate over this when I think it was Manchester United played Liverpool at Old Trafford at the start of this season. It was Erik ten Hag's first big game, and they doubled Liverpool's sprint efforts. And it was just after they'd been thumped by Brentford, where again Brentford doubled their sprint efforts, and Sky had this big debate over is that a determinant of performance? Is if you sprint more, do you win more? Things like that. I'd argue that there's no linear correlation there. Otherwise, Marco Bielsa would have won the league with Leeds in the last 2 seasons because they were the top of the sprint every season, but they nearly got relegated the season previous. I'd argue there's no linear correlation, but there is, if you're going to play certain styles of football, there is a minimum that you need to be able to tick that box. Very much similar to the NFL Combine, if anyone watches that. Anyone's a big American football fan, they do that bench press test. Everyone looks around. No one who wins the MVP in the Super Bowl has the highest bench press. I don't think there's anyone who's ever done that. But it's ticking a box. It's making sure that they can do the minimum they need to be able to perform at that level. Similar to the speed measures and things like that, is we know how fast players have to be effective in that area. I'll go on for a different tangent here. Basketball as an example. If you're going to play the power forward or something like that, you need to be 7 foot. You can have the best will in the world, you can be the best technical player in the world. There is a performance requirement there. Very similar, there's an external load requirement to be able to play certain styles of play, at certain levels and things like that. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Any other question? It's fine.
Perfect. Lovely.
That's all right.
Lovely.
Thank you very much for your presentation.